Welcome to this special webinar of the Coalition of Faith-Based Organizations. We're delighted that you've joined us today for this important conversation. The title is Violence Prevention: How Faith Leaders Can Save Lives. This webinar continues a conversation that was started last November at the Grace Cathedral in San Francisco being the venue where the UN Charter was first signed 75 years ago. This conversation about prevention of violence that was begun in San Francisco at our coalition conference consisted of a group of representatives of 7 of the world's religions, representatives from the offices of the local senators and congresswomen from California in the Bay Area, representatives of the office, United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, experts, and a pastor, for example, from Oakland, working to get young men out of gangs. We want today to identify practical ways for faith leaders to assist the world in shifting to a culture of prevention that will save thousands of lives, protect millions of women, and save hundreds of millions of children from violence. World leaders have committed at the UN General Assembly to significant reductions in violence as part of Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Today, we will hear of proposed solutions that tackle the roots of violence. We will hear of initiatives that have been proven scientifically to reduce violence by 50%. We will hear of a few cities that have achieved and sustained remarkable reductions in violent crime by pioneering offices for violence prevention. We will hear of initiatives in Latin America where street and gender-based violence are higher than elsewhere in the world. And we will hear of exciting initiatives by UN Habitat and by Peace in Our Cities to multiply the number of cities that are pioneering such successes. The rise of Black Lives Matter and movements to defund police are issues of the moment, but they continue a massive, long history of public demonstrations that have taken place over many decades, particularly in the US and Mexico, calling for a cultural shift to prevention and investment in young people and women. It seems difficult to get the transformation from over-relying on systems of criminal justice that too often punish the poor and the disadvantaged, while too often allowing for brutal lapses in unnecessary use of police force. So the central questions are, how can faith leaders use their influence to spread the word? How can faith leaders partner with United Nations agencies? How can faith leaders partner with city leaders determined to achieve a world safer from crime? We have an excellent group of panelists for this program, and just briefly introducing them at the outset, we have Dr. Irvin Walsh. He's Professor Emeritus from the University of Ottawa, author of the book Science and Secrets of Ending Violent Crime, immediate past president of the International Organization for Victim Assistance. We have Dr. Veronica Martinez Solares. She's Director of Research at the Foundation for the Study of Security and Governance in Mexico, a member of the Board of Directors, the International Organization for Victim Assistance, holds an MA in Victimology from the National Institute of Criminal Sciences, and LLB with honors from the National Autonomous University of Mexico. We have Ms. Rachel Locke. She's the Director of Impact Peace at the Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies, University of San Diego, co-facilitator of Peace in Our Cities initiative. former senior policy advisor at the UN Agency for International Development, USAID, former head of research for violence prevention with the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies at New York University Center for International Cooperation. We have Mr. Juma Asiago. He's the director of Safer Cities Program with UN Habitat based in Nairobi, Kenya. He's an urbanist and a social scientist, graduate in sustainable urban development from Oxford University. He built the global network on safer cities together with former mayor of Mexico City and current Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mexico, Marcelo Ebrard. We have the Venerable Dr. Bhante Chao Chu. He's the president of the Los Angeles Buddhist Union. He's chief abbot of the Rosemead Buddhist Monastery, executive committee member of the International Committee of the United Nations Day of Vesak, and advisor for the International Association of Buddhist Universities. And last but not least, as a panelist, Dr. Muzammil H. Siddiqui, Imam, Islamic Center of Orange County, California, chair of the FIC, that is Islamic Law Council of North America, president of the Academy of Judaic, Christian, and Islamic Studies at UCLA, MA from Birmingham University in England, and PhD in comparative religion from Harvard University. So very, very impressive group of panelists to lead us off. And really, I have to express greatest appreciation to Dr. Irvin Waller, along with Dr. Michael Plotzer, who is my co-chair of the coalition. But Dr. Waller really is the brainchild of this initiative, and I'm going to give him the floor. He will take a little bit longer. Each panelist has 6 minutes initially with some follow-up questions. Dr. Waller will take a bit longer, as much as 10 minutes, to kind of lay out the issues. Dr. Waller, you have the floor.
Thank you, Tom. So I'm going to talk to what do we know and how do we use it to reduce violent crime by 50%. And I want to start with a quote from Edna Chavez, a 17-year-old from Los Angeles, who spoke about her brother's murder to 500,000 people in Washington, D.C. for March for Our Lives in 2018. And she said, "I lost more than my brother that day. I lost my hero. I also lost my mother, my sister, myself, to that trauma and that anxiety." She said, "Police departments and schools continue to profile and criminalize us. Instead, we should have a department specializing in restorative justice. We need to tackle the root causes of the issues. Policymakers, listen up. Fund mentorship programs, mental health resources, paid internship and job opportunities. We need to focus on changing the conditions that foster violence and trauma." That death is a tragedy. They say 1,000 is a statistic, but these annual statistics are not inevitable. They are preventable. They are horrendous numbers: 500,000 homicides in a year across the world, 25 million women raped, 1 billion child victims of violence, 7 trillion in loss of GDP. The world leaders have already committed to transformations to get results in the Sustainable Development Goals. SDG 5 talks about reducing significantly the number of victims of sexual violence. SDG 16 talks about reducing significantly the number of homicides and child victims of violence. We know a lot about the root causes and risk factors of those tragedies. These include lack of life skills, adverse childhood experiences in the family, youth exclusion, inequity, and guns. These causes and risk factors are not solved by more police and incarceration, as multiple studies have shown. I want to illustrate it by giving you a simple comparison between Chicago and Toronto, the third and fourth largest cities in North America. Identical populations, identical median household income. Chicago with 13,000 police officers, Toronto with 5,400. Chicago in a state that incarcerates at an unbelievable rate of 564 per 100,000, roughly 4 times the average world incarceration rate. Canada, slightly below the world average at 107. But Chicago has more than 500 murders in a typical year, and Toronto has less than 80. We need to think about these differences and what causes them. What are the risk factors? Are these guns? Are these social inequity? But they're certainly not police, courts, and incarceration. Today, we have solid violence prevention science on what actually reduces crime. We have multiple government academic sources that identify the same proven solutions, but we are not using them. These pictures of the covers are just some of the websites that are freely available. The last one, for instance, is that of the World Health Organization, covering over 3,000 different projects that have been shown to work. What I did in my book on Science and Secrets of Ending Violent Crime was to use those sources and many academic sources to identify what really does end violent crime and how it can be implemented and why there is a compelling case for us to make the transformations that our leaders have called for. In brief, what is identified by those sources can be listed. There are a limited number of winning solutions. This slide just shows 4 of those that achieve more than a 50% reduction over the typical system of police, courts, and incarceration in advanced countries. Outreach services to young males gets them out of gun violence. Parenting in early childhood reduces the chances of people growing up to be violent. Hospital-based interventions with victims give us information about how to tackle the risk factors and help people not come back to hospitals again. School curricula change the way that people think and act on their emotions. We also have 7 essentials for the implementation of science that have been identified by ECOSOC, the UN Committee on Social Affairs, and we're going to hear more about this when Juma Asiago talks from Habitat. They start with an Office for Violence Prevention. They go on to say the work should be guided by the science that is available. They talk about diagnosing the problem and mobilizing those who can tackle the causes. They talk about adequate and sustained funding, not project funding, not the sort of funding that we see in so many Western countries, including the US, that does not really do the job that needs to be done. And they talk about standards and training for the talent who must implement it, and they talk about involving the public. The cities that are successful are limited at this point, but some of them are in high violence countries. You'll hear later about Bogota, Coahuila in Mexico, and Diadema, which is in Brazil. Huge reductions, 50% reductions, and maintained over time. You'll hear about Boston, a short-lived success story because it didn't add the funding and didn't sustain and didn't have that Office for Violence Prevention. It's being replicated in Oakland, as we heard in San Francisco last November, and in other cities in California. In countries with lower violence rates, we now have the Glasgow model with an impressive 50% reduction within 3 years, because they set up an Office for Violence Prevention, they followed the diagnosis, and that is now spreading to other regions in the United Kingdom, 18 regions already out of the 40, and London. In Ontario, these sorts of planning are required, but not necessarily the office. So what is adequate and sustained funding? It's roughly the equivalent of 10% of what we spend on police, courts, and incarceration. But we also have to spend the money on that Office for Violence Prevention. I like to call it the equivalent of a cost of a cup of coffee for every citizen in that jurisdiction. Surveys, surprisingly to politicians, because they don't seem to follow them, show that the majority of the public and victims from victim service surveys want prevention. We also know that many advocacy groups, from March for Our Lives to Black Lives Matter to many other, want prevention, and particularly those that involve mothers. We know that there are huge benefits. Yes, many lives saved, many fewer women raped, many fewer child victims of violence. But we also know that when you reduce violence, you can significantly increase GDP, particularly in lower and middle income countries, but also in the ghettos where so much of the violence, both on the street and in homes, occurs. And most of the proven actions are actually investing in the futures of people. I've listed here 3 things that I think are useful resources for faith leaders, and I will put them in the chat after I finish. So what is it that faith leaders can do? They can increase awareness about what works. So we need to help them have material for sermons, for religious services, for discussion groups and more about what works and how it's implemented. We need to get more human talent trained. And we can help the professional development of faith leaders by helping them have material in their initial training and in those who are actually involved in community outreach. We can also help with sustained investment in proven and successful programs by getting faith leaders to call for the shift from punishment to prevention. You're going to be hearing more about the international movement to accelerate decisive actions. So now I hand it back to Tom.
Thank you very much, Irvin, and a lot of appreciation in the chat for your slides and your very systematic presentation. I really applaud you for the focus on prevention, which is a whole area too, and how do you work with conflict in the world, and prevention is so much better than trying to resolve conflict once it's started. Maybe just as a follow-up, if I can ask you to elaborate a little bit more on suggestions specifically to faith-based organizations and faith leaders, how they can better convey these ideas, first learn these ideas, convey them to their grassroots communities, because they do have a unique access to grassroots communities. So maybe just for the sake of our audience, elaborate a little bit more on some action steps from the faith-based community.
Well, the effective actions, I think, are consistent with all the basic principles that are promoted by the world's major religions. But we really need to help them see the importance of the transformation from a punishment-dominated process that results in really oppression of the poor, and in some countries, the US, for instance, overuse of police and incarceration against Black populations. And we need to help them see the really strong evidence for that shift and the many benefits. And from my perspective, the faith leaders are incredibly influential, and we need to do the steps that help them access this knowledge and get it into their tools, their sermons, their discussion groups, and also into proclamations that are made by the leaders of those different religions when talking to the world.
Well, thank you. And I think we'll have a chance in the discussion period to come back to some of the points that you raised and get more elaboration. But let's turn now to Dr. Veronica Martinez Solares, who comes to us from Mexico. I know she had not been feeling well. We're very, very happy that she is able to be with us. So Dr. Martinez Solares, you have the floor. We've lost sound and we've lost the video. Unless we can solve it very quickly, I'm going to move on and we'll come back to you, Veronica. But I'd like to, in the interest of time, move on to Ms. Rachel Locke, and she's Director of Impact Peace at the Joan Kroc School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego. So Ms. Locke, you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Sorry we lost Veronica, but I assume that we will get her back. She's wonderful, I've heard her before. So I direct the initiative Impact Peace, which brings evidence, knowledge, and tools of what works to some of our most pressing violence and peace building challenges around the world today. I'm also a co-facilitator of a platform called Peace in Our Cities, which is mainly what I'm going to be discussing today. Peace in Our Cities, which is a coalition, a platform of 16 cities and growing. We have about 3 more in the pipeline, likely to start in the next several, to join us in the next several weeks. It was launched 1 year ago on International Day of Peace, September 2019. So we're just coming up to our 1-year anniversary. And the desire of Peace in Our Cities is to bring much greater attention, resources, and political imperative around this idea that is captured in the Sustainable Development Goals and Goal 16, Target 16.1 specifically, that we can and must significantly reduce all forms of violence and related death everywhere. The Peace in Our Cities aims to leverage the potential and the power of the Sustainable Development Goals, which we see as quite transformative in terms of a shift in how we think about what it means to be developed. The agenda, one of its greatest strengths, is also, as critics would say, one of its weaknesses. It's very ambitious. The 17 goals of the SDGs are very broad, but we must be ambitious, right? We cannot allow those who suffer violence and abuse to continue suffering. So the ambition is something that we see as a strength. The integrated nature of the SDGs. So yes, we are talking about Target 16.1 and significantly reducing violence, but we are also talking about culture of peace and nonviolence, which is in Target 4.7. We are also talking about addressing arms flows, the tools of violence, which is Target 16.4. We're also talking about justice and enabling more just societies, equal pay for work, labor rights, etc. The SDGs are not just confined to one set of countries, they are universal. They are for all of us everywhere in the world, regardless of whether you are living in the United States or in Kenya or in China or in South Africa. There's a heavy emphasis on localized approaches and a heavy emphasis on partnerships, all of which are very critical to the violence prevention endeavor. Sorry, I just had a scrolling challenge. So why are we focused on urban violence in particular? Many people think about violence in the world today and they think about conflict. The fact is that the majority of lethal violence takes place outside of conflict zones. So roughly 600,000 people die every year violently. This unfortunately is on trend to increase. This was true prior to the pandemic. This is projected by many to be even more true as the pandemic continues to ravage. 9 of 10 violent deaths takes place outside of conflict zones. And nearly half of all of our cities between the size of 250 and 500,000 people face epidemic levels of violence, simply intolerable. So that's why we're choosing to focus on urban violence, which is a neglected area of focus. We believe there's great reasons for optimism. Dr. Waller spoke about many of them in his presentation. There are effective strategies. There are things that we know can work. We have seen study after study, some of them Dr. Waller presented, some of them are listed here on the left, of cities that have effectively reduced their homicide rates and their serious violence rates. We know homicide is not the only form of serious violence. And we also know that cities are actually more effective at reducing violence than their respective countries. So we have the tools, the evidence, and the knowledge to deliver impact. Cities where increasingly the vast majority of the world's population live are on the front lines. They hold vast potential. What you see on the left are some quotes from some of our members, from Escobedo in Mexico, from Bangui in Central African Republic, supporting peace in our cities. So a couple things to bear in mind, just with my last couple minutes here. So violence, we know, is different. It presents itself differently from location to location. Context matters. Solutions that are being put forward here must be adapted, and different capacities and jurisdictional legal authorities must be taken into account. With that said, there are a few things that we know is true, that we know are true, one of which is that most serious forms of violence is sticky. It concentrates in particular people, in particular places. And we need to focus on those people, those who are at highest risks, both of suffering the impacts of violence and of perpetrating or committing acts of violence. Very often, those specific individuals are left out of the conversation as we focus on a broader population. A couple areas of idea for partnerships with the faith community. The first is to be human-centered. So very often those who commit acts of violence have had violence committed upon them previously in their lives. They have witnessed violence, they have suffered violence, they have lived in homes that are violent. This creates deep traumas. We need to be addressing those traumas at the same time that we are addressing the violence. We need to be looking both short-term at instances of violence today and the much broader underlying structural causes that is enabling certain people to be falling in the gaps where many of our social services, where our benefits of society are not reaching them. Violence prevention and violence reduction efforts also need to be relationship-centered. So what we have seen is where the legitimacy, where communities and people see their government institutions, in particular their policing institutions, as lacking in legitimacy, you tend to have higher levels of violence. So faith leaders and individuals from the faith community have served great roles in providing a bridge between community members and institutions of the state, particularly in contexts where those state institutions have been abusive towards the population. And the Boston example that Irvin spoke of earlier, faith leaders were there at the very start of that initiative, which helped lead to a 60+% reduction in youth violence. Providing a space for belonging is extremely powerful and important. There's been research by Patrick Sharkey that has shown that an increase in community and civil society support to violence prevention has a direct correlation to actual reductions in violence. And then finally, I know I'm coming up at the end of my time, faith leaders can help in being solidarity centered. Very often those who are suffering the greatest from violence are those with the least power and the least voice in society. By using the voice of faith leaders, this can motivate real change through action. And increasingly, we are seeing that happening both here with what's currently happening in the US and around the world. And that is crucial if we remember that those who are at the losing end of violence are very often those who do not have power in society, and their voices need to be heard and amplified through solidarity. I think I went a minute or two over. I apologize for that, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel, for that excellent presentation, and also once again for some very informative and helpful slides. Again, emphasis on prevention. I note that there are several universities in San Diego that have San Diego as the name, but my understanding, University of San Diego is a faith-based Roman Catholic institution, and so your work is embedded in a kind of a faith-based context of sorts, which is very important. Maybe you could just add a brief word, just what does it take? I think the focus on cities is excellent, because we often talk about world peace, and it's so big and grand, and how can we get the US and China to be at the negotiation table peacefully or whatever. But a focus on cities is fantastic, and I like this concept, peace in our cities. What can faith leaders do? Is there an example you'd point to where they've already been instrumental and effective in their work, or how would they reach the mayor or the city council?
So the example that, again, I provided with Boston, again, faith leaders were there from the beginning of the design of the intervention in Boston, which came to be known as the Boston Miracle because it led to such significant reductions in violence prevention. Importantly, in that in that case, there was a partnership, right, with scholars from the Harvard Kennedy School, with police, with other community organizations, and with some members of the local government. So that's just one example. We have people from the panel from Los Angeles who are going to speak about that context, but Father Greg Boyle is in LA as the head of Homeboy Industries. I think one of the things that he has been instrumental in doing is presenting a different vision to a majority of the public who thinks about violence, and let's be honest, they sort of shy away from it. It's not something they want to think about. It's not something they want to talk about. They think about crime and violence. Those are scary individuals. Those are scary things. I don't want to think about it. And so one of the things that I think faith leaders can do is influence the narrative, change the narrative. So this human-centered point that I made is really, really important. And we've seen this in El Salvador as well, where the church is one of the only places where individuals can actually have hope of leaving the gangs, which are extremely violent. Much of that is about, let's think about the whole person who is either involved in committing violence or suffering violence, and not just think, oh, there's something violent and scary over there, I'm going to look the other way and hope the police take care of it. It's a much broader conversation.
Oh, thank you once again, Rachel, and we'll come back to some of these points as we move on. I note that I see the screen of Veronica Martinez Solares, and if we've overcome the technical difficulties, I would like to turn now to Dr. Veronica Martinez Solares. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry so much. This is the first time that I have technical problems, and probably this is because right now there is online schooling for kids and young persons. That is probably the reason, because it happened to me. I was really surprised and really nervous, but thanks again for the invitations, and I'm going to initiate my time. Okay. From the Mexican Foundation for the Study of Safety and Security in Governance, we recognize that there are many efforts and advances in the prevention of violence and crime. However, it seems that not enough has been done, and the pandemic has exposed our greatest weaknesses, and therefore there are the greatest therefore, the areas of greatest opportunity with challenging circumstances and needs. First, I want to point out the huge potential that FBOs have to implement violence prevention and to achieve very good results. To do this, I would like to emphasize 3 points. The first one is that insecurity, violence, and crime are the main threats to the life of peoples, the human rights, the democracy, the rule of law, and sustainable development in the regions. Since 2010, support for democracy in Latin America has been declining, mainly due to insecurity. Populist, authoritarian, and repressive measures are supported more by citizens. This includes executions, lynchings, increasing prison sentences, about abuse of the police force, and so on. This is largely because people don't perceive that other solutions exist due to the very high levels of violent and violent crime in the countries. And just some numbers that Irvin has already mentioned. In 2017, Latin America spent more of its GDP on security than developed countries with lower rates of violence, while the United States invests 2.75%, France invested 1.87%, and Germany 1.34% in the fight against violence. And in Latin America, we are investing 3.55 according to the Inter-American Development Bank. But it is not all just about money. Since 2013, Latin America and the Caribbean are considered the most unsafe and lethal regions in the world. The Americas account for 37 of the homicides in the world. Almost all of them occurred in Central America, in which accounts for just 8% of the world's population. During 2018, there were 17 homicides every hour. Mexico is the Latin American country with the fastest growth in homicide, going from a rate of 8 in 2007 to another one of 27 in 2019. That meant an increase of 337.5 just in 10 years. Over 2 million people over 2 million young people aged 15 to 29 died in Latin America between 2000 and 2015. That is, these numbers are just terrible. The proliferation of organized crime and gang-related violence, which disproportionately affects youth, has become a growing problem in the region, affecting specifically the Northern Triangle country, that means Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, over the past 2 decades. Firearms robberies, kidnapping, extortions, and other crimes with high rates in the region. But it is not just those numbers. Latin America already has the highest rate of gender-based violence in the world. 8 countries concentrate 80% of global cases. Homicide against women are the highest in the world. In Mexico and Honduras, homicide is the second leading cause of deaths for women of reproductive age. In El Salvador, a woman is killed every 18 hours. Homicide in Mexico has reduced the life expectancy of youth women by 20%. Talking about femicide, the Northern Triangle has the highest rate in the world. The femicide rate in Honduras is 6.8 and El Salvador 5.1. Sexual violence is also very high. It represents 20% of all acts of violence against women in the region. In Central America, it included sexual slavery by the Maras gangs and organized crime groups. Sex trafficking in girls and women has also been rated one of the highest in the world. Domestic violence is the main form of violence against women. Violence is particularly serious threat to girls. In 2018, Guatemala registered more than 9,000 pregnancies of girls between the ages of 10 to 19. Almost 100% of the cases, child sexual abuse by a close relative of the girls was documented. Impunity, the results of corruption and inefficiency in the judicial system, is a key factor of the problem of violence against women. In addition to the high percentage of unreported crime, only 2% are reported and investigated. There is only one solution in 0.1% of those cases. We have international experiences, as Irvin has already pointed out, but the main problem is that militarization is involving the reality in Latin America, and it is not the solutions. International experiences indicate that beyond institutional weaknesses, government cannot depend exclusively on the security and criminal justice system because its operation is activated when crimes have occurred. The formula more police, weapons, prosecutors, judges, or prisons is necessary at some point, but it can provide some results in certain contexts, but it is inefficient because the nature of their attribution is not aimed to addressing the risk factors and causes that generate violence and antisocial behaviors at the economic and human costs at very highs. For example, although homicides have decreased in the last 3 years in Brazil, Guatemala, and El Salvador and Honduras, for the most violent countries in the world, the rates continue very high and the methods are very questionable. According to some measurements, in 2015, around 4,670 young civilians were killed in Brazil and 400 in El Salvador by militarized police. And I just have 1 more minute, and I would like to move from this mano dura that is not the solution, that those solutions that have been implemented in Latin America to trying to get better results. And in 2015, we developed with the Eurosocial Initiative from the European Union, we developed one regional model taking the experience of the countries of the regions and the experiences from the Latin American countries. And one of our main conclusions was the importance of faith-based organizations as one of the main actors in the reduction of violence in the most dangerous places. And 3 examples of them is the reduction of more than 50% of violence, very violent crimes in 3 countries in the region. The first case was Colombia as the main example in Latin America. What Colombia did, one, the country reduced availability of alcohol, reduced guns, and reduced gender violence. In Mexico, Coahuila, as Irvin said, a multi-stakeholder coordination and local intervention plan was implemented, as well as the reduction of alcohol. And right now, Argentina, Córdoba in Argentina, is implementing a Córdoba Citizen Security Plan that is involving all the institutions in the state. And this is very important because we need champions for the prevention, and that is what faith-based communities can do or are doing. That is the clue, the key factor for Latin America. Right now, it is providing. It is not what they need to do. The organization are providing social support and community solidarity in many municipalities. Is supporting and care for migrants, supporting and giving assistance in attentions of crime victims, and most of them are defenders of human rights of vulnerable sectors such as indigenous people, migrants, are victims of serious human violations, but they can do more. And this is because more than 80% of population, for example, in Mexico, is declared that practice some religion, 80% are Catholic. And the potential human talent for Catholics in Mexico is truly huge. One, they know directly the problems of the community at the most micro level of human relationships. Two, they know a positive social capital that governments are rarely able to identify. Three, very broad convening powers for many, many actions, not only for religious actions, but also for prevention and attention to victims. For still with great influence on a community level in two aspects: moral and the culture of lawfulness. And one example is specifically for the Catholic Church that is being implemented in Latin America is the solving those everyday single problems that don't represent crimes. And for more for a deeper intervention, probably El Salvador is the most relevant case, and I would like to take in a second part from the El Salvador experience. And thank you very much.
Yeah, well, muchas gracias. Excellent presentation. Just a brief follow-up in these three examples from Argentina and Mexico and Colombia, the cities there, where was there faith-based organization engagement? Do you find resistance from faith-based communities, or there is a willingness perhaps, but a lack of information, for example?
That is very interesting, for example, in Coahuila, where the bishop is very active on human rights. And he was asking for one placed in the Mesas de Seguridad, that is the coordination table for safety and security in the state. That is, the religious approach was very close to the government and to communities to solving the problems they have, specifically related to organized crime. The second one was in Colombia. Colombia right now is implementing a second step for the Acuerdos de Paz, the peace agreements. And religious leaders are very involved in that initiative. Right now, the USAID project is training these communities to explore more transitional justice and to explore more problem solving at the community level, those related to community problems, not crimes or to human rights violation. That is how faith-based organization can interrupt violence before any other conflicts could escalate to an homicide or a human rights violations. And the third case is Argentina. Argentina is very interesting because the Pope is from that region. And previously to this experience, the main coordinator of the Córdoba program was very close to the Pope. That is, he's very aware of the potential of the faith-based community, and that they sometimes just need information, training, a lot of transparency on the actions they are doing, and a lot of support from authorities to train and to support the efforts at the community level that faith-based organization and implementing. And as I told you, probably the main example is El Salvador with the truce. What was the truce? La Tregua between the Maras. It was directed by two very important professionals, one from the secularity section, that is Adam Blackwell from the OAS, and the Bishop Emiliani, and they achieved an agreement with the Maras to stop the violence. And in less than 6 months, they reduced 80% the homicide in El Salvador, just with that coordination.
Thank you very much once again, Dr. Martinez Solares. We will now, I'm happy to move on to our next speaker, Mr. Juma Asiago, who comes to us from Nairobi, Kenya, where he's director of the Safer Cities program with the United Nations Habitat. Mr. Asiago.
Thank you very much. This is a great opportunity and a great moment for UN Habitat to be invited to an audience of quite a central significance to the city's agenda on a topical area that the UN is increasingly finding as a prerequisite to sustainable development. We now know from the previous three speakers that crime and violence have become major challenges for cities today. We have understood from the evidence that the three presentations have shown that they are crime and violence is threatening the social cohesion and the economic stability of cities. Crime violence is damaging and creating fear in many parts of the world, both in the global north and in the global south, threatening the quality of life, the human rights perspective, the socioeconomic stability of cities, and particularly affecting the poor. We now understand from global statistics that 1 in every 5 people around the world has become a victim of crime and violence. And it's for this reason, amongst some key major challenges that the world has faced, that world leaders came together in 2015 in New York to set a new plan of action for the world. This is what we define as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, that in particular seeks to reduce the levels of urban crime and violence in cities, make cities more livable spaces. And in this, UN Habitat, as the focal agency of the United Nations responsible for city agenda, for the city agenda, comes in with a dimension of how to change the narrative of safety from one that looks at exclusively the criminal justice and policing mandates as the responsible players to the reduction and prevention of crime and violence, to one that actually promotes safety as an issue of better urban governance, promotes crime as everybody's responsibility, and looks at the key role of local authorities as pertinent to that change narrative that our world seeks. There is no better time than this when, with the COVID-19 pandemic, the world has seen a lot exposed around public safety and its institutions. And to a certain extent that we all are seeking to reimagine public safety in a new paradigm that supports citizens and communities as the key actors of change. This supports the evidence that Irvin has also presented here today, that builds the prevention narrative at the center of that conversation. Our program, Safer Cities, looks at urban safety as a crucial entry point to addressing social cohesion. In fact, we see that violence and crime affect social interactions and the relationships between communities and its institution. The Safer Cities program works with approximations and strategies that are sustained on the social and institutional dimensions of safety, and promotes the culture of prevention as part of the quality of life of communities. Our focus is on the co-production of safety and security, where safety is seen evidently to improve quality of life, well-being, and peaceful coexistence. We seek to build the conditions necessary so that local authorities and other relevant actors, including the faith-based organizations, are better equipped to participate in the provision of urban safety, particularly in the developing countries. The program's mission has been one that seeks to enhance citizens' role as key agents of change, and to seek ways of systematizing and making the Safer Cities experiences available to the international community. We have now 25 years of experiences working in not only Latin America, Africa, Asia, but as well in Eastern Europe. We have, through these experiences, learned a series of lessons that lends support to the knowledge systematization process, which the three speakers have ably been able to capture from evidence. But one aspect that I would like to emphasize here is relating to social capital that builds in our reference to families, professional, spiritual, and neighborhood networks. In other words, it alludes to the strengths or weaknesses of social bonds and shared values, which we think is key to the change narrative on safety. We have seen, for instance, many negative inspirations of solutions for addressing crime and violence that have not taken into account the social capital and social integration. From a design perspective, we have seen the investment of cities in gated neighborhoods in the face of crime and violence that have only further instilled a culture, an architecture of fear. We have seen from an economic perspective that the notion of poverty and impoverished neighborhoods have served to be seen as the causes of crime, only further criminalizing the urban poor who suffer from that social exclusion. From a social perspective, we have also seen some classical sociological schools claiming to say that some individuals are born with criminal and deviant behaviors, and that has helped to stigmatize certain communities within our midst. Our approach at UN Habitat is that no one was born criminal. It's the socialization processes that each of us is exposed to that shapes our attitudes, our behaviors, our lifestyles. And by embedding safety and the safety work in that perspective, member states have now adopted UN system-wide guidelines on safer cities and human settlements to really bring to the fore this change narrative, to take the challenge of safety into opportunities to enhance the quality of life, the well-being, and the peaceful coexistence of communities. We are right now working on a safety monitor to enable local governments to work on a local governance of safety scale, where communities are integrated in the way safety is produced and where government's public taxpayers' money is used to aid those community-based interventions. Faith-based organizations have leverage to build on these values by looking further upstream to inform interventions, especially in extreme deprived and high violent neighborhoods. UN Habitat has worked in several cities in Africa and Latin America with faith-based organizations to try to build the narrative of cities for people and people for cities. We think that religious communities are uniquely positioned to prevent and respond to violence. We think that the faith-based communities with their extraordinary moral authority, they are able to influence thinking, foster dialogue, and set priorities for members of their communities. We call on those faith-based organizations to join us now at the global level in the global network of safer cities with local governments and other local stakeholders to build local governance of safety coalitions to protect and promote the co-production of safety for all. I believe, in conclusion, that our work, which is linked very much with what the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime is doing, that links the SDGs in a way that integrates safety across virtually all the safety, the goals of the 2030 agenda, can actually come to bear on how we take and transform the way we communicate and resolve conflicts without violence, how we teach from religious texts how to promote non-violence, non-discrimination, and respect for all, and how we build the damaged social fabric of cities using these change parameters with meaning and reflection at the center. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and very encouraged by the emphasis on developing the social capital and building the strength of the prevention narrative. I'm wondering, and very encouraged to hear that UN Habitat is like many UN agencies, which has seen a sea change in the last 10 or 20 years of understanding that you have within the faith-based community a tremendous asset that can be a willing and able partner to many of the UN's initiatives. I'm wondering if UN Habitat has thought about creating a liaison officer to faith-based organizations or something that can be a little more specialized in mining the capacities of faith-based organizations as an ally in your work.
Yes, indeed. As you are aware, the UN Habitats Agenda has always been referred to as a partnership agenda. It's one that seeks to transform the notion of government to governance. And at the center of our work is really the stakeholder engagement framework. The faith-based organizations are a key aspect of what we define as the civil society engagement. And indeed, in every other year, we hold a World Urban Forum that brings together all these different actors to really discuss and dialogue with national governments and local governments to find best ways of addressing policies and programs in your own cities. And so this is really the framework, as the Secretary General calls for the Decade Campaign for Action, to really see how we really reinforce this institutional arrangement and bring in the faith-based organizations in the implementation of the new urban agenda.
Yeah, well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Asiago. We feel UN Habitat is in good hands with your a very eloquent presentation. We now move on to two concluding panelists, both of whom are faith-based representatives. And I'll begin with the Venerable Dr. Bhante Chao Chu. He's president of the Los Angeles Buddhist Union. He was with us at Grace Cathedral last November for our Coalition of Faith-Based Organization program there. And we had excellent presenters there, and he was among them. Venerable, you now have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for introduction and also inviting me to participate in this very important discussion. To make things a little bit shorter because of the time constraint, I would like to say that we always hear those numbers and statistics and reports and what is going on and what is going on. But all the issues or the problems involving violence has its causes or the causes. We are talking about the people, always look at the effects, but not the causes. The root causes are very important. Just now, Irvin Waller also talked about the root causes a little bit, because if we do not pay attention to the root causes, we may not be able to take care of the problems. So the relationship between the cause and effect in the Buddhist teaching is always emphasized, and that is the core teaching. So to prevent, we have to understand the causes again, or the cause. Actually, sometimes we don't see there are many more causes than what we see. So just now, I think I heard about those, what you call the Peace in Our Cities program, and they have something in Sri Lanka. But the thing is that I just want to say, for example, sometimes the faith-based organizations are also creating violence over there. They go there to convert people into those poor communities, and then feed the people and give little money, and then the families, and they have their own culture. I mean, sometimes they create the problem. So how do they count? In the last few years, I've been investigating about these conversion cases. And there it is true in many other countries, even in Laos, even in Thailand. I mean, I can give you enough evidence. And from my experience, that what we can do is, like what we are doing the programs, like in Los Angeles also, we did the program. For the time being, we stopped because of lack of staff, like the troubled youth program. People, the high school kids, they do little mistakes here. They fight in the park and they steal something from the shop, or little things happens, and then they go to the court, and then all these things. And then, of course, we do have connection with the judges and the probation officers and all the local county sheriffs and the police. So what they do is, and after sentencing, whatever, they send us, these kids, to do, let us say, 50 hours of community service or 100 hours of community service or something like that. But this, we make use of that opportunity, not to let them to do the hard labor, but also let them to do little work here and there, cleaning and do some work to feel that working is not easy. But at the same time, we counsel them, we talk to them, and we'll tell them how their parents are working so hard to keep you up and then feed you. And then so if, instead of, you know, we are using different techniques to teach them and talk to them. We are not talking about religious or beliefs or anything like that. We are talking about social values, the moral responsibilities, and then other things. So I think the curriculums in United States, when we talk about we have to talk about these moral responsibilities and then the social issues and interconnectedness of that. And also, I mean, there are many other things we need to put together to talk on this issue. And then if religions can teach ethical values, talking about here ethical values again, ethics also very important, but most of the religious, what do you call, in discussions or the sermons or something, I think we are not emphasizing enough our religious ethical values. So and also religion should play a major role. We all talk about that, but the thing is that creating peace, educating. You know, we have to educate our children. I'm not talking about academic education, I'm talking about social education. We have to learn how to live first rather than, right now, people are teaching to survive. Survive, stealing and cheating and doing all kinds of things, and whatever they can do, they can survive and then build their, whatever called monetary or prosperity or whatever they call it. But we are talking about here learning, teaching people how to live with respect to the other people, with respect to the animals, with respect to the seniors, respect to the neighbors, respect to everybody. So even respect to the employers, employees, the government officials. I mean, a lot of other things we can talk about when we come to discuss on this subject. So, and again, talking about this violence is related to poverty too. And then we have to think about eliminating poverty. Like in Sri Lanka, we have community centers. We teach computers, computer training, free education. Those kids cannot go. This is about $100 for the whole course if they go to a place to study. But they cannot afford to pay that $100 for 8 months to go to our courses. But we give them free education. So we have about 1,000 kids every year coming out of those centers, and then they can find some decent jobs. So we have to work rather than talking about this in a small scale or large scale. So there are so many things to talk about this subject, but I think time is limited, so I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Venerable Dr. Chao Chu, for raising this issue of root causes. And I think we're not only talking about, sometimes we say root cause, we mean the economic conditions, but there are other angles at which to take a look at root causes. And I think you brought out the issue of moral agency, moral responsibility, moral education, and spiritual education, and how that can be one of the factors that we should not overlook. So I thank you for calling attention to that, and also giving reference to the situation in other countries, and pointing out that the religions are not themselves without some weak points in certain areas that have contributed to some of these difficulties. I'm going to move straight ahead to our final panelist in the interest of time, and invite Dr. Muzammil H. Siddiqui, also from Los Angeles, and a very distinguished scholar of Islam. And please, you have the floor now, Dr. Siddiqui, and welcome.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Dr. Walsh, Dr. Waller, and others who are involved with this Universal Federation. I participated in the San Francisco consultation. Appreciate these efforts and wish them success. Violence has always been among the human beings, but in our world, it has increased in intensity, variety, as well as frequency, as you saw from the presentations that were presented before. Hardly a day go by where we do not hear about violence. It is like a pandemic. It is everywhere, at homes, in schools, at the places of worship, at the sports arena, entertainment centers, streets, malls, airports, as well as among states and governments. There is state-sponsored militias and there is stateless violent organizations. All people should be conscious of violence and should do something to curb, control, and eliminate it. Prevention of violence is a big task, and it cannot be done by any one group alone, be it religious or governmental. It requires collective thinking and collective action. Prevention of violence requires building loving and caring families, good teachers whose job should not be only to teach, but also to impart good moral values. It is truthful and responsible media and entertainment. It is just and fair economic and political system. It requires combined planning and combined resources. It needs impartial and fair-minded reconciliation groups. Prevention of violence is the primary job of police, law enforcement agencies, and governments, but should also be the concern of all civilized people and civic institutions. So I'm pleased that UNODC and other UN agencies are supporting these efforts. They should be more engaged and active. The theme of violence prevention and the role of faith-based organization is especially important. We are living in a global village. Our world is a pluralistic world of many races, religions, languages, and cultures. All our faith emphasize peace and development of good individuals and good society. Unfortunately, religions are also exploited by nationalistic groups to create conflict and tensions. It is important that faith-based organizations cooperate and collaborate for the benefit of all of us. Now, as for Muslim organizations and governments, many of them are active in these efforts. Here in the United States, my organization has been very conscious of that and has issued statements whenever there is any violence that comes from the Muslim side. We speak against it, condemn it, as well as we emphasize very much working for the relief of the victims of every faith. So there are relief organizations that have become very involved when they are involved in doing that, as well as educational efforts and participation with private as well as government and interfaith organizations. So these are the efforts that we are doing, but it is important that we all remain involved. There are, unfortunately, conflicts. Somebody raised the question about what is being done about the Shia and Sunni conflict in some parts of the world. Although Shias and Sunnis existed for centuries, almost 1400 years, there have been Shias and Sunnis. So this division is not a new division. It's like division in other faith communities. But sometime, and especially at this time, in some countries, it has been exploited for political reasons. So that's why it's very important to have some kind of a political dialogue in the countries. Saudi Arabia and Iran should have political dialogue, and many other places, and should be encouraged rather than governments in the West or other places siding from one group or the other group. It is important that they should try to see, this organization, for example, and others should try to see how to bring reconciliation, how to bring dialogue, and bring the people together. Islam emphasizes that God created all human beings from one and the same parent. They are diverse in colors, races, and ethnicities and viewpoints, but they are still one family. They're equal, and they have rights and duties towards each other. They are to fulfill their duties to each other and struggle for their legitimate rights with mindfulness of God, wisdom, and care for other beings. Islam emphasizes that there is no basis for claims of superiority on the pretext of color, race, or nationality. The best people are those who are best in their behavior and conduct. Our scripture, the Quran, urges us to cooperate and work with each other. It says in the chapter number 5, verse 2, cooperate with each other to do what is right and good, and do not help one another in sin and aggression. So the principle of cooperation is that one should support any person, anywhere, anytime, as long as the objectives are right and good. One must not support any person, anywhere, anytime, if the objectives are sinful and hostile. So I would like to emphasize our solidarity and standing together with all people of goodwill and civilization against hate and violence. We all should be concerned, because when some of us not safe, all of us are not safe. It is well said, injustice in any place is a threat to justice in every place. So we are connected with each other. And Prophet Muhammad said, whosoever among you sees evil, let him prevent it by his hand. If he cannot, prevent it by his tongue. If he cannot do, then in his heart. But this is the weakest position to be for a person of faith. We together must take wise, careful, and effective action to prevent evil. We should speak against evil and must never accept it in our hearts. We do need to prevent violence against the poor, the blacks, the women, the minorities, the immigrants, the refugees, the political prisoners, and a lot of innocent people. It is a big task, and it requires our collective efforts and cooperation. And thank you very much. May God bless everyone.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Siddiqui. Also, thank you for responding to Sheikh Ramzi, who submitted a question that was also on this issue of Sunni and Shia. I think you answered it very effectively. And we are really, I'm sorry to say, running out of time. I am going to mention a couple of the questions that have come in addition to Sheikh Ramzi at Oxford University, but also we have a question from, because I'm going to invite the panelists to give a final summation, just a 2-minute final intervention each, and I'll conclude with Irvin Waller, and then I'm going to ask my co-chair, Michael Plotzer, to add a word about upcoming events. But Dr. Henry Nyagaka Omai, founder Restoration of Life Center based in Kenya, just talks about how can we engage in more awareness raising in the local contexts and regions to come up with solutions to violence in the communities. I think much of this has been addressed, but I want to acknowledge that important question. We had a question from Jeannie Kagawa that is talking about in building social capital, the importance of the family, and that the traditional family in many places is under great stress and strain, and is enough attention being given to family strengthening. And I want to just make reference to a question from Susan Crossway about the role of youth, and as it relates to urbanization and youth often leaving their families and moving to urban centers, and if this contributes to the explosion of violence in some of our cities. But having said that, and having heard from such wonderful speakers, I'm going to invite the speakers to take a brief concluding word. I'm going to invite first Rachel Locke, and then Veronica, Mr. Asagiago, and Bante Chao-Chu, Dr. Siddiqui, and then Irvin Waller. So Ms. Locke.
Great, thank you. 3 quick points. I'll keep it brief. The first is, yes, we absolutely must address the root causes, which I would say are the factors within society that have intentionally, in many cases and situations, kept certain individuals out of positions of influence, out of the ability to gain and benefit from society as a whole. So that means worse schools, that means less investment in communities, that means fewer jobs, that means no attention to trauma that's taken place in the US, that means redlining, intentional discrimination, etc. So yes, we absolutely must address that. We also must recognize that we need to address the acute manifestations of violence today, and that addressing root causes is a much more medium to long-term endeavor. We have to do it, don't get me wrong, but we have to do both. We have to address the person who is at risk of violence today, perpetrating and victimization, and also be addressing in root causes. We can't separate those two, which is what this field tends to do, and it's a miscalculation. Second point, I'll be very quick. Peace in Our Cities welcomes more members. If anyone is interested, either a city or an organization, I will put my email in the chat box. Please send me an email. Third point, to reduce violence, we need to want to reduce violence. There's tools, techniques, evidence, knowledge. We know how to do it. We need to want to do it. The vast majority of people need to want to do it. Unfortunately, right now, a lot of people would much rather cover their eyes and pretend it doesn't exist. That's key.
Thank you. Dr. Martinez Solares.
Thank you very much, and I do agree. I would like to point out just 2 main ideas. The first one is that we need to work to basic premises. The first one is, as Rachel said, that we have the knowledge, we have the techniques, we have many successful cases, we have very good tools, as Irvin said, to prevent and to reduce violence and crime, but we need political will and technical leadership. And from the technical leader side, I would like to point out that with highly trained human talent and evidence-based models of comprehensive prevention of violence and crime amongst clerical persons and, for example, the Catholic Church, we can do a lot of actions. The first one is we can work with communities and people no one wants to work with almost always, as Richard pointed out before. We can solve those problems before they are becoming seriously crimes. We can stop confrontations between rival groups such as gangs, as El Salvador example. We can promote a culture of peace and lawfulness, and we have many cases around the world. Just 3 months ago, the UNESCO published a handbook that is strengthening the rule of law through education, that I have the honor to participate. And I checked more than 650 cases of how religious centers, schools, and non-school systems can help to teach ethics, the cultural lawfulness, peace, ethics, and other actions to improve the life of kids and to improve our futures. And finally, with the FBO potentials, it could become positive role models at a time when Latin America suffered from the absence of proactive leadership. Applying evidence models is probably the best way and the only answers that we have right now.
No, thank you very much. Mr. Asiago.
Yes, my main point here would be safety requires leadership, is a question of values of citizenship, and we need to start seeing what meaning and reflection can do to rebuild the social fabric of our cities and towns, to first and foremost appreciate the nature of cities as heterogeneous and differentiated. That is the strength of cities across gender, across age, across culture. When we begin to see this as a strength of cities, then at the heart of this appreciation will lead us to attitudinal changes in how we approach crime and violence in its differentiatedness and how we grow peaceful coexistence. It is why I emphasize that the social capital dimension, and why I emphasize that religious communities are uniquely positioned to prevent this, that religious and faith-based organizations with almost 5 billion people belonging to these communities, their leaders have the potential for action in this direction. We need to see young people not as problems. We need to see them as resources to be developed. We need to understand that the nurturing of young people today does not just happen within the family unit. Their family also is about the peer group in their neighborhoods. And we need to understand and approach this with a positive dimension, seeing the art in each of these young people to get them engaged in broader social justice movements. I think in a nutshell, I would like us to move from a perspective of just addressing the city from a risk dimension to one that sees the coping and adaptation abilities and building reflection and meaning around that.
Thank you, Mr. Asiago. Venerable Bhante Chalchu, a final word.
All right. Okay, now, actually, we all have to work together. It doesn't matter in what level, what kind of work we do, to understand the root causes and also not just the symptoms. I'm going to emphasize again, because most of the time what we are doing is, in many cases, we are paying attention to the symptoms, not the root causes. So root causes can help to eliminate the future problems. So that we need to collaborate and coordinate and then educate and then teach in different levels of our people, even from the government level to the whatever the level that we've talked about. All kind of groups need to be educated, how to change their behavior, how they are thinking for the benefit of all, not for their own personal agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Siddiqui, please.
I want to emphasize that the faith-based organization should work together. There is a need for more understanding among the faith-based organizations, especially on the issues of values. We have a lot of common values, but we don't emphasize them. It will be a very good idea that we come up with a list of common values that can help us to work together and have more trust of each other. So this is very important in the faith-based organization, to have trust of the among themselves as well as among the people of other faiths. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Siddiqui. And now I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Irvin Waller for a concluding remark before I invite Dr. Platzer.
Well, it's been an amazing hour and a half with incredible insights, incredible suggestions, incredible conclusions. It's very hard to add to it. I really just want to come back on a couple of points. I think it is really important to raise awareness of solutions. I think our government policies and our media promote too easily the reactive strategies of policing and criminal courts and incarceration and punishment, and do not promote nearly enough the strategies that will in fact make our communities safer, make our individuals safer. So I think in everywhere, in school curricular, in religious leadership, in the media, and everything we do, we have to do a lot more to promote prevention rather than reaction or cure. And I think we have to talk about the benefits of doing it. We are living a period where, once again, demonstrators have taken to the streets of the richest nation on the globe, a nation that has one of the most sophisticated systems of policing, courts and incarceration, and spends massive amounts on that incarceration, but fails to achieve the levels of safety that we see in countries that have dealt with what Rachel describes as the investing in the social capital. And the US is the inventor of many of the short-term solutions, but not the user of those solutions. So I am in shock really by the discourse from Veronica Martinez Solares about the situation in Latin America, the climbing levels of street violence and of gender-based violence, and the failure of militarization and the resulting corruption in the systems of police and courts to deal with that. And I think we really need systemic, I would really appeal to religious leaders across the world to be more direct about the importance of prevention rather than cure, of investing in solutions, in ways to reduce the homicide, to reduce the violence against women, to reduce violence against children. And I would really appeal to the vision of the UN General Assembly of what the world leaders did in 2015 in giving us a vision for a world with significantly less violence. Those leaders didn't give us the solutions. The solutions exist, so we now need to do a lot more to get those governments to actually raise awareness themselves and invest in solutions. And thank you all so much for sharing your wisdom. Thank you so much for those on the chat who have made so many suggestions about follow-ups. So Tom, I'm sure you're going to talk about how we can access the recording and the slide presentations so that we can move this further forward.
Sure, we'll be following up on both those points, but keep in mind everything will be posted at coalitionfbo.org, www.coalitionfbo.org. Thank you, Irvin. You did fantastic in pulling this all-star team together. I want to turn it over to my co-chair, Michael Plotzer. We kind of alternate in running these webinars, and he's behind the scenes on this one, central to everything that's taken place. I want him to talk a little bit about some of the upcoming programs. Michael, I hope you can hear me. I see you. I think I'm going to have to move on. I'm very sorry. Michael is working on a project for the Vienna International Center, the UN headquarters in Vienna, the UNODC on transnational organized crime, a conference in October. We'll put more information on our website. This program will be posted on the website. We will follow up with each of you as panelists, and if we don't have your PowerPoint presentation, please send it to us. And I know there's tremendous interest in the content that has been shared here. I just have to add to what Irvin said. Truly, you amazed us with the quality of these presentations, and very, very grateful for all the work you put into this webinar. More importantly, to the great work you do every day to prevent violence and build a safer and better world. So with that, and also on behalf of Michael Platzer, myself, thank you all. And we will have another webinar on September 15th on the topic of ethics, education, and governance as applied to criminal justice and criminal justice reform, faith-based perspectives. Thank you, we're signing off. Thank the audience. Sorry we couldn't get to every question. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.